Hello, I'm Michael Bird. Welcome to the Nazareth to Nicaea vodcast and podcast, the show where we look at everything pertaining to the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and generally the origins of early Christology. This week, you are in for a treat because I'm interviewing an up-and-coming young German scholar by the name of Ruben Bühner, and his new book from Baylor University Press, Messianic High Christology. This is a terrific book. I think this is one of the best books on Christology in the last 5 years, because what Ruben does is he wants to situate the Christology of the New Testament, of early Christianity, in the context of Second Temple Judaism. So he's got a number of comparative studies. He's got a number of exegetical surveys. He looks, the major Christological texts of the New Testament, like Philippians 2, Revelation 5, various other significant texts. I mean, obviously, the Johannine Prologue as well. And he shows how these are all kind of variations. These are all within reach of the sort of messianism that you would find within the Second Temple period. This is a great interview. You're going to love it. And by the way, I have a free copy to give away. That's right. The generosity just never stops. So if you go onto the YouTube channel and if you put in a question or a comment with some way of contacting you, I'll pick someone randomly who can get a free copy of the book by Ruben Bühner on Messianic High Christology. So no more from me. Hope you enjoy the interview. Hello, I'm talking to Ruben Bühner about his excellent book, Messianic High Christology. It's a terrific book, wonderfully designed. It's absolutely gorgeous, I have to say. And all I can say, Ruben, is es ist großartig, mich Ihnen zu sprechen. It is great to talk to you. I mean, I don't know that German made any sense. I tend to read.
It did. Hi, Mike.
I tend to read rather than really speak it, which is ironic because I was born in Germany. In the Nähe von Paderborn.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I definitely don't have a Paderborn accent. That's what I've been told. I've actually been told I speak German with a Dutch accent. So I don't know how you get that. But Ruben, it's great to have you. I mean, I really love this book. I think this is terrific. I think it's very accessible, very useful, and hopefully it's going to introduce a lot of people to understanding early Christology in light of its Jewish context. But first of all, could you tell us, who is Ruben Bühner?
I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich in Switzerland and also at the University of Tübingen in Germany. So I'm working at the Department of New Testament Studies, and most of my research is connected to Second Temple Judaism and tries to relate Second Temple Judaism texts to New Testament texts. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's terrific to know. Now you finished your doctorate and you're now doing, I believe, the Habilitation, so which is a second doctorate to get your qualification to teach in a German university. And this book, your first book was Hohe Messianology, which is a very dense, detailed book about early Christology and Second Temple texts. I spent 3 days reading this book, Ruben. So
thanks for that, Mike.
And that's not because it's long and difficult, it's because my theological German is so rusty. I spent 3 days reading it, but I think I got a basic grasp. Now, this book is not simply an English translation. This is kind of a separate standalone book, although it does touch upon, it is largely based upon your earlier work. In this book, you argue that Second Temple Messianism is the primary context for the high Christologies found within the New Testament. And one phrase that you use time and time again is talking about how New Testament Christology, early Christology, is within reach. It is in Reichweite. It is within reach of Second Temple Judaism. Do you want to explain for us the main thesis of the book in your own words, Ruben?
So in really short, I try to show in how far even the portrayals of Christ as some kind of divine being in the New Testament still belong fully to a kind of a messianic discourse. So what I'm not saying is that there's nothing unique or distinctiveness within the New Testament Christologies, but I think that all New Testament Christologies, even when they portray Christ as divine or some kind of divine beings, are still highly connected to the messianic discourse. That is, the author of the New Testament text, they didn't think they were doing anything else but kind of taking part within this messianic discourse. And it was only later, let's say second or subsequent centuries, the Jews as well as non-Jewish followers of Christ began to take the divinity of Christ or the divinity of the Messiah as a distinctive criterion for distinguishing between, Messianism and Christology.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, what would you say is the criteria for being divine? What makes someone divine in antiquity? I mean, because there's different definitions of what constitutes a divine being. I know Richard Borkham likes the idea of a divine identity. Larry Hurtado prefers the idea of, worship. I think Chris Tilling has talked about the relationships between a deity and the people. Do you have your own conception on what makes someone divine or a divine being?
I mean, obviously, that's a really crucial question for the theme we discuss. I think that most or maybe even all Jews in Second Temple Judaism, they thought that there was the one supreme God and that their God was supreme to every other kind of divine beings. But at the same time, they didn't agree, or maybe they didn't even think about what was actually the criterion for distinguishing between the one God and all the other, divine beings. So I think the difference was for them more on kind of an intuitive level. They were they all agreed that their God, the God of Israel, is supreme to all the others. But if you had asked them, so what actually makes him different? The answers would probably be quite different. So I think that Hurtado might be right that the act of cultic worship, so don't give worship to any other divine being except the one God of Israel, that this could have been the answer for many Jews. But I don't think we have enough evidence to say that all Jews in Second Temple Judaism would have agreed with this kind of definition. Other Jews might have pointed to what Borkham says, that the difference is God the creator of all things, or all the other divine beings created by the one God. I don't think that, looking at the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, we know that we have in all the different forms of Jews. I don't think it's reasonable to assume that they would have agreed on this kind of definition. We don't have this definition in an explicit way in any text. We only can engage the question in an indirect way. So looking how does this text portrays God, the one God of Israel, next to all the other gods, but there's no text which gives us an explicit definition, and I don't think there is any, but in different texts, different Jews take a different approach to this question. But still, they agree that there is something like a monotheism, what we call monotheism, in the sense of the one God of Israel is supreme to all the others.
Okay, that's good. I mean, and there's all sorts of debates about, was there a monotheism in the first century? Should we call it monotheism? Was Israelite religion ever monotheistic? Did it start off polytheistic and then did it become monotheistic, or did monotheism just get invented in the 17th century with all the other isms? And scholars have
when I say monotheism, I say what I mean with monotheism is that there's a difference between the one God of Israel and all the other gods. So there are many divine beings, of course, in the heavenly realm, but there is some kind of difference, although most texts don't tell us what the difference is.
Okay, so Israel's God, you could say, is species unique, or at least unrivaled, but the precise criterion or metrics are disputed based on the text you're reading at the time.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, well, that's a good way to sum it up. Here's one. Does the Old Testament teach a divine Messiah? Because as you point out in the book, when Justin Martyr is talking to Trypho says we all expect the Messiah, the anointed deliverer of Israel, to be a human being. So is the Messiah just a human being, or does he in some places become a divine or quasi-divine being?
I mean, it depends how we understand Old Testament, of course. I mean, looking at this, the Messianic text of the Old Testament is, of course, a really tricky question. I'd say, does the Old Testament teach a divine Messiah? Yes and no. Of course, I'd always approach this question by looking, is there evidence that some Jews in Second Temple Judaism understood some Old Testament texts as portraying or as hoping or expecting the Messiah to be in some kind of a divine being? So when we form the question like this, then I think, yes, we do have evidence that some Jews understood some text of the Old Testament, especially in the Septuagint version, as hoping for some kind of Messiah who is in some way more than human. I actually prefer to phrase it like more than human, so I don't have to answer the question, is it already a divine being or something in between, and where's the criterion for being divine? So I prefer more the question like the Messiah more than human, and yeah.
So this is where I'll crack out the literally one word I know from Nietzsche. So is the Messiah something of an Übermensch? Is he like a superhuman figure that's along a divine spectrum? Maybe not divine precisely the same way as Israel's God, but he has supernatural characteristics and a heavenly origins.
Yeah, and he has attributes which are normally only attributed to the one God of Israel, but not necessarily all attributes which distinguish the one God from all other beings.
Okay. Is there a particular text that you could think of that illustrates that?
That people have understood the Messiah this way?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, pretty sure it's in 4th Ezra. It's pretty clear. I mean, 4th Ezra talks about it's at Daniel 7, and it takes up Psalm 2. So we have Psalm 2 in a lot of texts. Psalm 2 is probably the most important Messianic text of the Old Testament. So we have it in Psalm Solomon 17, and we have it in 1 Enoch, and in 4th Ezra, and also in the Midrash, in the eschatological Midrash in Qumran. But interestingly, let's say Psalm 17, which takes up Psalm 2 and refers it and understands it as talking about a Messiah, doesn't read it as kind of a superhuman Messiah. So it doesn't take up, let's say, the idea of divine sonship and puts it to the Messiah. But 4th Ezra is differently. It obviously takes up Psalm 2, so the Messiah standing on Mount Zion in 4th Ezra 13 and defeating the enemy. So the allusion to Psalm 2, it's clear. And at the same time, 4th Ezra portrays a Messiah which is obviously more than human. He comes from the heavenly realm. He comes with the clouds. He beats all the other divine beings, and he has superhuman power. He's in some way pre-existent. So I'd say, yeah, 4th Ezra is a pretty good example. 4th Ezra understands Psalm 2 is referring not only to a Messiah, but to some kind of superhuman Messiah.
Okay, so the reception history of texts like Psalm 2 demonstrate an amplifying of the divine qualities of a messianic figure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Now, you go through, in this book, you go through several different parts of the New Testament, and you offer these really excellent comparisons between something in Judaism and then something in the New Testament. And in one of the earlier chapters, you compare the Melchizedek scroll from Qumran, 11Q13 or 11Q Melch, where in chapter 2, you've got this figure Melchizedek, and scholars debate who he is. Is he a priest? Is he an angel? Is he the heavenly representative of the congregation of the last days? But he's described with a lot of divine language from Isaiah 61, I think Psalm 82, all this divine language is attributed to this mysterious Melchizedek being. And then you kind of put that in comparison with Philippians 2. So can you tell us who is Melchizedek according to the Melchizedek scroll at Qumran?
Melchizedek, I mean, the first question is Melchizedek some kind of messianic figure or not? So later on in the scroll, there is the prophet who is explicitly called the anointed of the Spirit. So it's clear that this prophet is some kind of messianic figure. Of course, we have the title or the attribute Messiah there. Another question is the prophet actually more or less the same as Melchizedek, or are there two different kind of figures who come at the end of the ages? I'm not sure about it. I actually prefer to say that they're probably the same. So Melchizedek is even explicitly called a Messiah or Messianic figure. But more important for me is that even if there are two different kind of figures, Melchizedek is still more like he's an eschatological agent of salvation. So at least in the broad category, he's kind of a Messianic figure. He will come at the end of the ages and will bring salvation and freedom for the sons of light, so for God's people, and he's sent by God to do God's work. So in the broadest sense, he's kind of a messianic figure, and at the same time, he's portrayed in angelic or divine categories. So he's called an Elohim, although there are many kind of Els and Elims in this text. So certainly Elohim is not meant as a reference to the one God of Israel, but it's some kind of divine beings. Melchizedek is said to be in the heaven among all the other divine beings, and he fights against Beliar, so against the host divine being, and so it's pretty sure that although he's a messianic figure, he is portrayed in angelic with angelic traits. Yeah, that's what makes him so interesting for comparing him to high Christological texts.
And so he is exalted, which means that there is a natural comparison with the Christ hymn of Philippians 2, where you also have a pre-existent heavenly figure who is exalted. Does that mean that Paul, or his source in the Christ hymn, does that mean Christ is being depicted as an angel or angel-like?
No, I wouldn't say it. So first of all, it's quite sure that Paul didn't know this text. Yeah, I mean that's always important when comparing these texts to make clear they didn't depend on one to the other in a direct way. It's only they both refer to what I would say the same messianic discourse. So in this indirect way, we can compare one text to the other. The problems with calling Melchizedek or Christ an angel is again the question of definition. What actually is an angel, and what is the difference between an angel and all other divine beings, or between the one God of Israel? So in modern categories, we always tend to say an angel is what in Greek is called an angelos or whatever. But I'm not quite sure if this makes much sense. Obviously, all the Hebrew and Greek texts, they have a lot of terms with which they can refer to some kind of divine beings, which tend to be more like all the same. So there's no real difference between an angelos, what we would call angel, and other Els or Elims or Elohims or sons of God or sons of Elims. So we have all these terms, and obviously they all refer to different beings in the heavenly realm, which are subordinated to the one God of Israel, but they're still more than human. So in the broadest sense, we would call those angels or divine beings. And if we take angel in this broadest sense, then we can compare, let's say, Christ in the Philippians hymn with Melchizedek in the Melchizedek scroll, but not if we look only at the explicit term angelos or angel. Obviously, Christ was never called an angelos in the New Testament text. So, yeah.
Yeah, not at all, exactly. And so, but Christ does get exalted to the status that becomes somewhat at least comparable to the way Yahweh is described in Isaiah. The monotheistic rhetoric of Isaiah 45 does get applied to Jesus, and I mean, scholars debate about how real what this is. Now, I know you see this language as principally honorific, so this is sort of a divine status.
In Philippians 2, yeah.
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 Okay. Well, that's interesting. You also have a whole chapter on Mark 14, 61 to 62, with Jesus's confession before the high priest, where the high priest says, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of glory." Now, this is a text that seems to combine Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, And in this chapter, you do a number of things. You offer a comparison with the depiction of the superhuman Messiah in 4 Ezra. And you also note the reception history of Psalm 110, initially in the Septuagint, or the Old Greek translations of the Hebrew, and then in several other texts and the way that Israel's king is described. And from that, you conclude that Mark definitely depicts the Messiah, Jesus as the Messiah, as a superhuman figure. Would you want to elaborate on that point for us, Ruben?
I'd say in Mark 14:62, it's obviously that if Jesus has talked about himself, and I think there's good reason to say that when he quotes Daniel 7 in this text, he is sitting at the right hand of the power, coming with the clouds of heaven, he's referring to himself. Then Mark, or Jesus in Mark, portrays himself, as kind of a superhuman being in all these claims that he will come again at one kind of second coming. He will come with the clouds of heavens, and coming with the clouds of heaven it's typical for theophany. So normally when God comes, he comes, he's depicted with clouds or whatever. And if Jesus says that he will sit at the right hand of the power, so at the right hand of God, that's another kind of what I would call superhuman or divine characteristic, which is not normal because it supersedes what normal humans have. So I'd say in this broadest sense, it's obvious that Mark 14 portrays Christ as some kind of more than human.
Yeah, but I've always used the language of him sort of, it's his appointment as Yahweh's vice regent, and it's honorific status, and it certainly presages his heavenly origins and divine status. Yeah. I think it's also important. I think that's when people talk about the synoptics having a low Christology and John having a high Christology. I've always been confused how you can read Mark 14:62 and possibly think that Mark has a low Christology.
I think the problem is that many scholars take kind of a hard definition at the beginning, saying what's the one criterion which distinguishes the one God between all other divine beings. And then if they don't find this criterion in a specific text, let's say in Mark, then they say, no, Mark doesn't have any kind of a high Christology. But as soon as we take a step back and say it's more difficult what distinguishes the one God from all other divine beings, then we can more recognize, all these different superhuman characteristics that are portrayed on Christ and that have some similarities to other messianic figures.
Yep, that's a very good way to put it. I find a lot of scholars that seem to think, okay, John's gospel is high Christology. The gospel of Mark is not John's gospel. Therefore, Mark's gospel is not high Christology. Whereas I think there are much different ways of depicting a divine being, divine status, largely the way in which you successfully exposit in this book. So that's the reason why I think this book is so helpful and so useful and will be so illuminating to many people. Moving now on to John's Gospel. Many years ago, I read Maurice Casey's book on Christology, From Jewish Prophet to Gentile God. And he argued that it's impossible for Jesus to be divine in a Jewish context because they had a big gap between God and ordinary creatures. And then Casey argued, but of course, when you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus is definitely divine. He's God. He's called my Lord and my God. And for Casey, that was evidence that John's Gospel has moved beyond Judaism, because you can only have a divine Jesus is if you have broken the boundaries of Judaism. As I understand it, Ruben, from reading the chapter you wrote, you would disagree with Casey on this point. So how do you see the prologue to John's Gospel as being a statement of Jesus's divine nature within Judaism? So how do we know John's prologue is indeed within Judaism and it hasn't broken the shackles of Judaism?
But obviously John's portrayal of Jesus as being divine is the most elaborated one in the New Testament, or at least, of the most discussed text in the New Testament. So what John makes with Jesus, he calls him Theos, he calls him God, and he makes him uncreated. So if we take the decisive criterion for which distinguishes between the one God and all of the divine beings as the question of creation or being created, then one could argue, okay, now in John we finally have it that Jesus is uncreated, so he's on the, if we take the creation creator divide, he's on the side of the creator and not only anymore on the creation side. And I'm quite sure that the author of John would have agreed and said, yeah, that's what I wanted to say when I made Christ uncreated. But how do we know, for example, that the author of Mark would have, agreed with John saying that, yeah, I didn't make Jesus uncreated because I didn't want to say that he's God. Did the author of Mark use the same definition or criterion? And how many Second Temple texts do we actually have where we can certainly say they take the creation created divine as being the decisive criterion? So what I wanted to say, obviously John is the most elaborated high Christology, but I think I'm not so sure if he has the highest Christology. With which definitions are we to say John portrays Jesus even more divine or higher, or whatever you want to call it, than, let's say, Paul or Luke? It's all a question about definition. So I'm more careful on this. So what I try with the chapter on the Gospel of John in my book is not to take this definition approach and to say, does John use a definition which was widespread before? I'm not sure about that. But to look, is this the way John portrays Jesus as being uncreated and calling him God, unprecedented? Or are there other Messianic texts which go in the same way? And so when we look at that, then I'd say John is further away from other Messianic texts which have survived for us, but there's still some connections to other Messianic texts. So especially if it comes to the predicate God, the God predicate, there are some texts which, like Laviku Melchizedek, when Melchizedek is called Elohim, it's not that far away from calling him God in Greek. And the other thing is, portraying Jesus as the Logos. Of course, there's no other Messianic text which does this in a similar way, but there are some Messianic texts which say that the Messiah's utterance, so his word, has some kind of superhuman power. So what I argue is that John obviously goes a step further, but he still takes up a lot of ideas and motives from the Messianic discourse. It's not only philosophical, portraying Jesus as the Logos, which has left the Messianic discourse, but the idea that the Messiah's utterance and his word has some kind of superhuman power was there already before the early Jesus movement, and John can take these ideas up and then combine it with other ideas with more philosophical approaches, and then he presents us his distinctive Christology. But I'd say it's still connected to the Messianic discourse, although it's obviously further away than most other New Testament texts.
Okay, so John kind of goes a little bit further in his own journey in how he accents divine Christology, but he's still a species of messianic discourse, and he's still using some of the language of divinity that you might find in someone like Philo or 11Q13. So, okay, so he's got his own sort of bold path, but he's still kind of amplifying or working with Jewish materials and a Jewish perspective.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. Another question. We'll stay in the Johannine corpus. You have a whole chapter looking at the Enochic Son of Man. Now, the parables of one Enoch are very strongly contested in terms of their dating and origins and provenance, but they do have a lot of similarities to the way Jesus is depicted, particularly in the book of Revelation. A way that Jesus is the Lamb, and both figures are given a throne in some ways. They receive a certain type of devotion, and they're key instruments for salvation and judgment. Ruben, could you tell us, how is the Enochic Son of Man and the Lamb in the book of Revelation, what would you say are the main similarities and the main differences?
In my book, I mostly refer to Revelations 4 and 5, so the Lamb sitting on the throne. And obviously, if we compare Revelations 4 to 5 to the parables of Enoch, then both present visionary images of the divine throne in the heavenly realm, and they're both talking about the Messiah sitting on this throne. It's important to say that the parables of Enoch are the only Second Temple text we know where the Messiah is explicitly said to sit on the one and divine throne. So they're obviously the most important text to compare to Revelations 4 to 5. In some, like Lawrence Stuckenbrook, would even argue that there might be a direct dependence between the book of Revelations and the parables of Enoch. That might be. I don't think this is decisive for the questions we discussed today. Even if Revelations didn't know the parables of Enoch, they still refer to the same Messianic discourse or the same ideas in Second Temple Judaism, and they don't both take these ideas in their texts and present them in their distinctive way. So the most important characteristic they have in common when they portray the Messiah or Christ in a superhuman way is that Christ or the Messiah is sitting not only on the heavenly throne. We have some texts where the Messiah is said to sit on the heavenly throne, but the Messiah sits on the throne of the one God himself. And obviously that's really bold and maybe even quite explicit, explicit way to say this Messiah has come really close to the one God of Israel. He's even allowed to sit on his throne. And another thing is the question of cultic worship. So is the Messiah or Christ worshipped as God? If we take Hurtado and all the great work he has done, then the question of cultic worship might be even the most important way how Second Temple Jews distinguish between the one God and all other Jews. And in Revelations 4 to 5, it's clear that Christ, or Christ as the Lamb, is worshipped in a similar way with the same words and in a parallel way than the one God of Israel. So that we have some kind of cultic worship of the Lamb or Christ in Revelations 4 to 5, I'd say probably all scholars would agree on that. Now the question is, do we have similar characteristics for the Son of Man in 1 Enoch? And Hurtado, he says, no, not really. I'm not so sure if he's right. I'd say even, especially in 1 Enoch 48, we have really all the same thing then as in Revelations, that the Son of Man is worshipped in more or less the same way and with the same words and at the same time as the one God of Israel. So I'd say there are some similarities when it comes to worship. But with both characteristics, so sitting on the heavenly throne and being worshipped in a kind of cultic worship, there are also some differences which leads to the conclusion that Revelations 4 to 5 goes one step further, at least, or maybe some more steps further. In Revelations 4 to 5, it is clear that Christ is sitting on the divine throne at the same time as God. So they both share the divine throne. In 1 Enoch, that's not really clear. So the Son of Man is never said to sit at the divine throne at the same time, as the divine God. One could understand 1 Enoch, the parables of Enoch this way, but it's not said in this explicit way. So I'd say Revelation goes one step further in making it explicit. Christ is sitting there at the same time than the one God. And the same with the question of cultic worship. So in 1 Enoch 48, the idea of cultic worship is portrayed in the future. So there might be the time where this Enochic Son of Man will be worshipped, and I'd say in more or less similar way than the one God. But in Revelations 4 to 5, it's not presented as some kind of visionary image for the future, but it's now in the present. Christ is already worshipped by the heavenly angels in the same way as the one God of Israel. So there's, again, Revelation is a bit further. It's not just the same, but it's obviously connected.
Okay, so some strong similarities between the way key saving figures are portrayed, but Revelation may go a tad further in having the Lamb and God together at the very same time. Okay, that's good. A lot of people try to make a big deal about angels and angel Christology. Now, this definitely becomes a big thing in the 2nd century. People like Justin Martyr are identifying Jesus as the angel of the Lord. Valentinians, all sorts of texts, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Epistola Apostolorum. You could argue that angel Christology in the 2nd century was probably the most ecumenical Christology. Everyone could describe Christ as an angel in some sense, maybe not the same sense, but in some way. But you argue that angel Christology was not there at the beginning. It seems to have come later. Could you tell us about your thoughts on the development of angel Christology?
The question of angel Christology or angelic messianism is so interesting for my book or my approach, because we have plenty of evidence that in Second Temple Judaism there are messianic texts, so outside the early Jesus movement, which portrayed or even explicitly call the messianic figure an angel. So let's say in Isaiah 9, the angel of great counsel, something like that, and then again 11 Melchizedek or other texts. So angel is a title for a messianic figure in Second Temple Judaism. But at least in the New Testament, angel, like angelos, isn't any explicit title for Christ himself. Christ can be portrayed in angelomorphic traits, so he gets some attributes which are normally attributed only to angels, but he's never explicitly called an angel, at least in the New Testament, but only in Second Temple, in the second century texts like Justin Martyr or something like that. So I framed the title for this chapter in my book, Paths Not Taken. So what I want to say is that the New Testament high Christologies are not the climax of all other high messianic texts we have before, but they only take some strands we have before and some motives and some ideas and refer them to Christ. But they don't use all ideas which are there before. And they obviously, at least in the New Testament or in the first century, they didn't use the title angel, which was there already in the Messianic discourse. They didn't use this title for Christ.
Yeah, so, and that's very interesting, particularly if people want to say that angel Christology was the earliest Christology. It's kind of peculiar that angelos is not there as a title in any of the primitive materials, whether they're pre-Pauline or Pauline themselves. Thanks. Final question, Ruben, final question. I'm thinking here about what some critics of your book might say. They might say, okay, look, this is very good in terms of mapping how early Christology, New Testament Christology is situated within Second Temple Judaism, how it resonates with Second Temple Judaism, the obvious strong intertextual connections. But some people might say you have completely ignored the Greco-Roman context of early Christology, that you haven't put in there Homer or Heracles or the various divine men. You've focused narrowly. Now you could respond by saying, well, that's happening in the next seminar room down the hall. I'm just focusing. But some people would argue that the main impetus for Christology and divine Christology is equally Jewish and the Greco-Roman world. So where do you find the main analog, the main influence Christology? Is it equally Jewish and Greco-Roman, or do you think we're dealing with primarily a Jewish phenomenon? So where would you see the Greco-Roman background? What is the significance of that for early Christology?
Yes, so I do argue and would repeat that the Jewish context or the Messianic context is the primary context. But at the same time, I would never, separate Judaism from the Greco-Roman context in the way that there are two different options we could take. So I would say, obviously, there's a lot of Greco-Roman influence to the New Testament, also to the portrayals of Christ. But this influence is more in an indirect way, because Second Temple Judaism itself was influenced a lot by Hellenism and Greco-Roman ideas, and Second Temple Judaism Messianism was influenced by Greco-Roman ideas. And through that way, of course, also the Christologies in the New Testament are heavily influenced by Greco-Roman ideas. But what I do not think, that there's a secondary major shift, let's say, between the historical Jesus or whatever, and then the New Testament writings, which had some kind of Hellenization, which separates them from Jewish ideas and makes them more un-Jewish than something else. So they're Jewish and Greco-Roman in the sense that everything was influenced by Hellenism in the first century CE.
Okay.
And you could argue that, say that the way Caesars or other emperors in Egypt or in Rome took on divine titles to themselves and portrayed themselves in some kind of superhuman ways, or at least with superhuman power, had obviously an influence on the way Jews in Second Temple Judaism hope for a Messiah. I mean, to fight against, let's say, a Caesar who is God or son of God, or to the king in Egypt who portrays himself as being God's son. Then you need a Messiah who is in the same way some kind of superhuman. Otherwise, he couldn't, beat them. So there's a natural influence, surely, from the, let's say, Greco-Roman ruler cults on the way Jews portray their messiahs. And in this indirect way, we also have the Greco-Roman influence on the New Testament and on New Testament Christologies. That's how I would put it.
Okay, so if I was to sum that up, you'd say the primary influence is certainly Jewish on the earliest phase of the Christian movement, but that Judaism itself is not insulated or siloed away from the wider Greco-Roman culture. The ruler cults are a very good example.
Yes, thanks for summing up my nasty English.
That's right. That's right. No, I'm astounded. You can reason and discourse so well in English when it's not your first language. Well, again, this is the book Messianic High Christology. This is probably, I think, one of the best Christology books written in the last 5 years. I definitely recommend it. Anyone who's into early Christianity, New Testament Christology will definitely want to get that book. It should be on your shelf next to the Hurtados, the Borkhams, the Ehrmans, and the Collinses. So, yes, congratulations on the publication of the book, Ruben. I hope you have a great success with it, and also with the continuation of your Habil. So, thanks for joining me on the show. It's been great to have you.
Thanks for the discussion and the opportunity.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too.